Hello from your favorite Grasslands PR team. Today we're back with another reason why these overlooked and underappreciated ecosystems are, objectively, not just in my opinion, the best biome. I'm Alan.
I'm Nicole.
And I'm Rachel.
Hello.
Hello, and today we're here for a very special spooky edition of The Best Biome. Bam, 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 bam. What's the scariest thing you can think of?
Oh.
Leeches.
I was going to say something that was way too real, so scariest thing I could think of
Natural
is...
In the animal kingdom.
Oh, in the animal kingdom.
Correct,
Okay.
yeah.
Prions.
Ooh, yeah, that's terrifying.
That's up there.
Oh, that would be a
That's
good
rough.
topic. This is not that scary.
Yeah, that's
Sorry.
pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad
My
I won.
answer is Nicole's answer.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds like cheating, but that's okay. We allow that here on The Best Biome. And
maybe that tongue-eating isopod, actually.
Oh,
That's a pretty
God.
good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have those in touch tanks sometimes. You can like touch them.
Yeah, can you
That's
put your
used.
tongue on him?
Oh, my
You know?
God. Moving along.
Probably not.
No, the scariest thing I can think of is a haunting memory from my childhood.
Oh.
Where
I thought this was in nature. Okay.
yeah. Where I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I loved nature documentaries, and I was like, dude, I love me some nature documentaries.
Sure.
And then one day, one of my friends was like, "Hey, Rachel, do you want to come over to my house and watch the show about worms?"
Uh-huh.
And I was like, dude, yeah, that sounds awesome. I would love to learn about worms. It sounds like a great time. And instead, I got to her basement and they were playing the movie Tremors.
I love that movie.
It traumatized me
Oh, okay.
as a little baby who just wanted to watch a worm documentary.
No,
And
I
instead, I
understand.
was like, wow, this is a monstrous creature with giant jaws and scary teeth. And it's like,
So I have a very similar experience because it should be noted Tremors is 100% a horror comedy. It is not a serious horror film.
I did not
But
catch the comedy part as a kid.
A child cannot catch that. I had a
No.
very similar experience with the movie Fright Night, which is also very goofy and very much played for laughs. And it horrified me when I was like 7. And I thought my neighbor was a vampire.
Oh,
Yep.
terrible.
It's okay. So it's okay. I'm validating your
Yeah,
experience.
thank
I'm saying
you.
that's okay.
Thank you. Well, I'm here tonight to tell you that there are some real scary worm-like things that live out there, and they live in the grasslands. So,
nice.
and we could cut this out. Originally, my topic was going to be vampire deer.
Yeah.
And then, I was looking into them, and it turns out none of them really live in grasslands.
Oh,
Yeah.
disappointing.
So I was like, well, I need to find something else that's, Halloween themed, that's a little scary, a little spooky, and that actually lives in grasslands.
Yeah.
And it turns out that there are some creatures that do.
Nice.
So I just wanted to let you know, we're going to start on a dour note because that's going to lead us to the happy place of
Sure.
talking about spooky worm things. Okay. So I don't know if you realize this, but habitat destruction
Yes.
in South America
Right.
and other parts of the world, but especially South America, has led to a golden age of new species discoveries.
Well,
Sure.
that's one
Yeah.
positive, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Journalist Sharon Geinup from Manga Bay, when writing about the plight of Brazil's grassland herps, described this creature we're talking about today
Ooh.
as predators up to 3 feet long
Oh,
with tiny limbs, small eyes, and a spade-shaped skull.
dang.
Quote, they undulate through tunnels, hunting in darkness.
Wow. Just like a graboid. That's what the creatures from Tremors are called.
Nice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
That's
you. Thank you.
not a very intimidating name.
Well, apparently it's good enough for Rachel. So, good enough for baby Rachel.
And in the Cerrado specifically, over 40 species of this group of creature have been discovered, many of which have occurred only because we're destroying everywhere they live.
Digging up those tunnels.
Digging up those tunnels, yeah.
Gotcha.
I just want to point out the number of Cerrado lizard and snake species rivals the Amazon's herp diversity, but with obviously much more limited protection. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why are we talking about herps when we were promised worms at the beginning of this episode?
What's the difference,
Yeah, well, especially when you see this creature, because the thing we're talking about today is a group of animals called worm lizards.
Nice.
These
Yeah.
have been all over my TikTok feed.
Have they really?
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Okay,
Is
great.
it because of you?
Yes.
We may need to unfollow each other.
Aw.
This is going to affect our podcast prep. Just kidding. Yeah, and so over 40 worm lizard species are found in just the Cerrado that we know of. And unfortunately, in those types of environments, in the grasslands of Brazil especially, some of the world's largest agricultural commodity companies are expanding their operations, including transnational corporations like Cargill. And that increasing habitat loss means that we're discovering so many new species as rescue and cataloging efforts expand. Yeah, woo! Scientific discoveries often do co-occur with the destruction of critical habitat. How exciting is that?
That makes sense.
Yeah, this group of animals does expand beyond the Cerrado, though. Do you guys know what the group is called for worm lizards?
Wait, I'm gonna guess. Vermin.
Nope.
Dang.
Close. No, actually not close at all. But that was a good guess.
Is it annelid something?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah.
Amphisbaenians.
Amphisbaenians?
Yes.
That's ludicrous.
It's so close to being amphibian that I have to look at the word every time because my brain can't just remember it. Yes, so these amphisbaenians live beyond Brazil. Their global range includes South America, Africa, the Caribbean, Mexico, Florida, California, the Middle East. Now, northern areas of the world have very few species. So, like, for example, we have like 3 in North America total, including like the Mexican one. And most of these are actually grassland species. In the Caatinga, which is a region of Brazil that we actually haven't talked about much on the pod. And I think that's because the Caatinga has a reputation of being a forest, but like often happens on this podcast, reading general descriptions of this habitat versus reading scientific papers paints a much different picture of what this environment is like. More on that in a second. But in just that region, 1.4 new taxa of worm lizard have been discovered every year for the last decade plus.
Dang.
Oh my gosh.
New taxa. Okay.
Yeah. And the Caatinga is the only exclusively Brazilian biome. It's described as a xeric shrubland, so it's sort of semi-arid, and it's also described as being a thorn forest, quote unquote, but like the Chihuahuan Desert, which is known for being a desert but has significant grassland communities, the Caatinga has significant grassland communities too, and in one paper was described as an arboreal savanna or a stepic savanna. So there was one paper that described just one of the new species of worm lizard from the Caatinga. It described this worm lizard's habitat as stepic savanna, stating that it lived in all these different types of grassland, like, you know, the Campos rupestris and the Campos typico and that sort of thing, Cerrado typico. So rupestrian grassland and arboreal savanna. This little guy is living in mostly plains and some deep valleys. And this new specimen that was described, I think this was, in 2020 or something like that. Yes, it was in 2020. This species was unearthed by bulldozers during vegetation removal. And because of that, this is pretty typical. We don't even know what its coloration looks like when it's alive because all we have is like the dead specimens that were passed along to the researchers like, hey, this is a new species. And so they're just like, in death and when preserved, it's cream colored. But who knows what it looks like when it's alive because we never saw it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Terrible.
So as of 2020, it was this one. They all have scientific names. They don't have like accessible common names, so I'm not going to say them all the time. But this was the 25th species known to the Caatinga as of 2020, and many of those species just in the Caatinga are known nowhere else. So this is like a group of animals that has very endemic little dudes that just are kind of everywhere and not very well studied. Yep, and apparently, just throwing it out there, the spread of these worm lizards across the world has less to do with like continents splitting apart type situations and more to do with apparently they're very prone to just rafting across oceans.
Yeah.
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 So,
that's how a lot of herps disperse, right? That's why there's
I guess
iguanas
so.
in the Galapagos.
Right.
Yeah.
And like fossorial burrowing worm lizards in the Caribbean. Yeah. So they just kind of tend to float around. And so their relatedness as a group kind of depends just mostly on whose ancestors colonized which areas.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just kind of relatable.
Yeah.
Are they all like 3 feet long, or are there some shorter species?
There's a huge range.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to get into what the heck this animal even is next. But I guess just to start off, that's a great question. And because they're so not well studied as a group, we don't really know which things are pretty general about the animal and which things are like just typical of the 1 or 3 species that have been studied well.
Sure.
So there's a lot of kind of conjecture. So yeah, my next question is basically, what is an amphisbaenian, which does not still sound like a real word. So the little dude I just mentioned from the Caatinga that we don't even know what it looks like when it's alive.
Sure.
I have some pictures of it as it was cataloged by scientists, and I would like for you to describe it for me.
Okay.
Ooh. Oh my, yeah. So now I could have sworn you had said that it had short limbs when you started this podcast.
Sometimes short limbs. There are actually only 3 species that have limbs.
Okay, so
all
the
of the
most-
rest of the known species are limbless.
Gotcha. Okay, which would make more sense given their name. This thing is very worm-like. It even has like its scales are even, it's got like the laterally segmented scales, almost like you would see in an annelid, like a worm.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, that's because it moves a lot like a worm.
Yeah,
They
that
call
makes
those
sense, yeah.
annuli, which I think might be the same term they use for earthworm rings.
Neat. Yeah, and it doesn't really have a well-defined head. It's very tube-like, just like a worm.
Does it even have eyes?
Does it have eyes?
Fantastic question. What do
Are
you
they,
think?
are they entirely subterranean?
They're mostly subterranean, yeah.
So,
Noteworthy some parts of the world where it lives are subject to like periodic flooding and seasonal rains and stuff. So when it does rain and their burrows fill up with water, much like earthworms, they do come up onto the surface
nice.
where they're subject to being preyed upon,
Yes.
possibly by birds.
No, yeah. I mean, this is an earthworm, basically.
Yep.
Yep. Well, let's
Slightly
why split
crunchy.
hairs? It is an earthworm.
What about its face?
Where's its face?
I think the
I
middle
see a
pictures.
mouth.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
looks like a line for a mouth.
The top row here is its face, and the bottom row is its tail.
Is C top down? No, A is top down. C is bottom up.
I don't know.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I don't
It's
know
like his
either.
nose is going
It's
over
really
his
hard
face.
And is F its vent? What is that? That's what are we
It's
looking
its
at?
tail.
F? That's its tail. Okay,
Yeah, I think it's like sliced open there, and that's why it has a slit.
gotcha.
Like it looks like a scalpel mark.
Yeah, this is basically just a worm.
Fantastic. I have a
Worm with
head-on
mouth.
picture. Do you want to
A
see
worm
it
with
from
a
the
mouth.
head-on?
Yes.
And that's its
dorky
butt
looking.
on the bottom. That's its little tail.
Oh, it's
Looks like a slightly dried up earthworm from this angle.
it's definitely a face. There, it looks.
It's got blobfish energy, in my opinion.
It does have a little bit of
does.
blobfishiness. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good stuff, guys. I think one of the things I want to point out is that the front and the back of this creature look so indistinguishable that it's difficult to tell which part is the head and which part is the butt.
Sure.
So that's noteworthy.
Yep.
Also, I mentioned that there are ones with limbs. So if anybody at home wants to see this, just Google Mexican mole lizard. But that's a Mexican mole lizard. So that's one of the few species that actually has limbs. And it's only 4 limbs.
Yeah.
This little guy looks like a huge dork. I don't really...
I love them.
They're
honestly.
great, yeah.
Very
it does
pink.
it has more well-defined eyes also, like very clearly.
Yeah.
You said it only has 4 limbs, like the answer
No,
would be...
the front limbs.
Oh, okay.
Oh, 4 limbs.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. I was like, what? How many would we expect?
As opposed to hind limbs.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
So, and in the species that don't have limbs at all, they do still have like a vestigial pelvis and that sort of thing. So they have, the equipment to show that at one point this lineage obviously did have legs.
Sure.
It seems like they evolved limblessness multiple times over different groups and completely separately from snakes. They do seem like they are like genetically more closely related to just true lizards, like the group that contains wall lizards and related species.
Okay.
Yeah. Now here's where things take a horrifying turn. I'm going to show you
Nice.
the skulls of these creatures, and I think this is going to shock you.
Oh.
Ooh,
They have
that's
so
very
many
cool. So they've got
They look like they have giant brains back there.
I don't know if they do.
Why is it shaped
can't
like
be true.
that?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. So they have like a really huge. I mean, okay, is this one of the eyeless varieties? Do we know?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the. They all have really, really reduced eyes. So that's.
But they have so are those like large sinuses, or is that like says from
I
like a sensory
guess.
organ, like a sniffer?
I don't know.
Are they sniff based?
And look how big their teeth are.
Those are large teeth, big
Mm-hmm.
chompers.
Yeah, they're very Tyrannosaurus-like in the sense that they are interlocking, like biting teeth, tearing teeth.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Which explains why sometimes you find like just limbs of lizards torn off inside their stomachs.
Do they go after like diet wise? I mean, you would think something subterranean would be eating lots of softer foods, grubs, and
Yeah, they will.
insects. But they do go after other lizards as well.
Yeah, they go after a variety of stuff.
I wanna ask, but I feel like you're getting to it.
Yeah, no, tell me. Yes.
Do they strike from below and grab things on the surface? Do they like listen for like the pitter patter, and then you just see like the earth, like a land shark coming up behind you, and then
That would be really, really sick. Unfortunately, I don't think that they really do that.
Well,
That would be really
all right.
fun. I know. And I guess to give you an idea, like here's
oh, they're so little.
so little. Yeah, they can be very
Yeah.
small. So, like Nicole asked earlier, they can be up to 3 feet long. They can also be itty bitty, like just literally earthworm sized.
Yeah.
So, some basic things about their biology that we know about. Normally, their tail is autonomous, which means they can pinch them off.
Self-amputate it. Yeah.
Self-amputation, yeah. You could kind of see that in one of the concentric rings. That's like it sticks out. That's like the break-off point would be. And the tail does not regenerate. It has one of the most specialized forms for burrowing invertebrates and has some extremely compressed heads. So everything that's going on in their heads is like weirdly compressed and small for burrowing purposes. This is also true of the entire group. They have large, powerful, interlocking teeth and powerful jaws. They're described as frequently tearing chunks out of their prey. And they have weirdly distinctive skin and distinctive movements. They sort of accordion forward and backwards as they're moving around. They have extremely reduced, sometimes nearly absent eyes, very powerful chemoreception, and like I said before, a butt that's pretty indistinguishable from its head usually. And those reduced eyes, and this is described as a general trait of the group. So, there's obviously variation, but across the group, they really can't see. The eyes don't have the equipment to do much more than detect light and to detect like where light is coming from, basically. So who needs to know any more than that when you're supposed to just be underground most of the time?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yep. So I want to tell you a few things that we know about these creatures. And the first thing I want to tell you about is how they move, because it's really weird. It kind of freaks me out, but more in like a body horror way than a Tremors way.
You said the accordion.
Yeah.
So like, so is it kind of like earthwormy?
It's very earthwormy, yeah. So they have those rings of scales, the annuli, and they form like a tube around its little tubey body. And this tube is only loosely attached to the actual body itself. So it's very slippery. And so basically they have like longitudinal muscles that go like down the length of the body along these, you know, rings of scales. And basically they'll bunch up the skin with the scales. So it's like the skin layer. They'll bunch it up in one area and just kind of like anchor it to the wall. The soil, rather. And then their skin is so detached from their bodies that the trunk muscles will move the body forward independently of the skin or like forward or backwards just within the skin tube to move itself along. And it can move equally well forwards and backwards. So not only is the head and the butt indistinguishable, but they can move equally well going both directions.
Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's unpleasant to think about.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop thinking about it now.
Okay, yeah, sure. Also, in general, the habits of these guys are really not known because they're super difficult to study. It's difficult to study any animal that's just underground all the time, especially one that's not just well studied at all. In 2021, a study of African amphisbaenians as amphisbaenians used pit telemetry to track their movements, and they basically showed like, oh, they're capable of moving long distances in a single day, and they can travel fairly quickly because they're very good at burrowing and very good at like schlepping through the soil. But they don't like to do that. They mostly just kind of hang out in the same area, at least the species they were studying. And they often show preferences for just the same literal rock over and over again. Like they'll catch one at a rock and then they'll follow it around with radio telemetry and be like, oh, it's still under that rock.
Yeah.
That was worth the radio equipment. But actually it was because, you know, sometimes they would come up to some of these worm lizards underground and they would be actively moving while they were trying to locate them. And it's like, it's just moving around on the ground. Like, it's going pretty fast. Yeah. So mostly it seems like youngsters and males float around more. But pretty much once they find a good area to stay in, they just stay there. And we don't really know much about other species. Like this is one species that's kind of well studied because its name pops up in papers over and over again. And that was a study published in 2021 where they were like, let's find out how they move.
Yeah.
So yeah. Who knows?
Fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, that's all I know about their movements.
So, okay, obviously they would be manipulating habitat quite a bit.
You would think so, yeah.
If they're, I mean, I understand, like, I get that some of them are like a lot more lethargic than others, or just kind of like, I'm just gonna, I like my rock.
Yeah.
But do they have any sort of, I guess, are the tunnels that they're generating, are they a habitat of their own, like, are they creating sort of
what an interesting question.
habitat for other subterranean wildlife?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, I've seen it more often the opposite way. I see more often descriptions of worm lizards that are utilizing other animals' burrows, which I think is interesting because these are animals that are extremely good at burrowing. So, you know, the choice to live in an ant nest alongside ants, like there's some that are even super specialized in coexisting with certain leafcutter ants in the Cerrado. And so, it is interesting to me that they can coexist with other animals and that they would prefer to do that in a lot of cases. But I have to imagine the big ones especially are creating habitats that are used by other animals. I mean, we've described when we've talked about soil in your soil episode, Alan, that there's, I don't know, just so many gradations of creatures living in the soil that even the really tiny ones, I'm sure, have to be creating something that's used by even smaller animals. Yeah. Like they're coexisting with a bunch of isopods and literal earthworms and other kinds of things.
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
They're also predators, so
maybe. Sure. I didn't know if they were like, if their tunnel networks that they're making were long-lasting sort of impressions in the soil. I didn't know.
Yeah, and they might be. And I know that, I mean, they're reptiles. And so like a lot of other lizards, they lay clutches of eggs and may presumably have some sort of parental care. More on like why we think that in a little bit, but it stands to reason, you know, if you've got like a network of little worm lizards hanging out together, that they're using the same burrows over and over again, and they're running into each other down there. So yeah, they must be using the same burrows. Again,
Adorable.
not very well studied though.
Right, yeah.
Most of these things we're just now finding in bulldozers. So yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about is their feeding. And as much as I love the idea of them like land sharking out of the ground and just grabbing things, they really don't like coming out of the ground. I guess that makes sense. The only times they really come out is like maybe if they want a sun. These little guys are very solar powered, like most lizards. Or if it's raining and they're going to drown in their tunnels, they'll pop out of the ground
Fair,
then.
yeah.
But otherwise, it's kind of dangerous to be an animal that can't see being out in the sun. And I did not encounter any papers studying how they use or sense vibrations. So if that exists in these animals, it's not been studied. People need to get on that.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. They were like, "Oh, we were chasing them around, and they were running away from us underground." Well, yeah,
They could probably
course they
actually
would.
kill you. Yeah, and that's like super well known in a lot of animals, and especially lizards, you know, that they often have adaptations in their jaws that allow them to hear better. I haven't found anything about that in my research. So there's a lot of stuff left to study, in my opinion. What we have studied in their face and in their jaws has more to do with feeding, because they do have really specialized skulls. And for the animals that have been studied, they are feeding mostly on arthropods. So to answer that question earlier, right now, most are assumed to be generalists based on some stomach analyses we've done for specific species. But again, some can specialize on specific groups. And vertebrate prey has been found too in their stomachs. And this is all based on stomach analyses and maybe some observations in the field. Some have preferences for beetles and beetle larvae. Some will eat grasshoppers. Some will eat earthworms and other things. But we have found entire lizards, lizard legs, and even mouse fur. Like they tried to get a mouse and it got away from them.
yeah.
And in labs, they will feed them neonate mice and things like that. So they have no trouble crunching through bigger vertebrate prey. And again, their skulls are described as very powerful, even though they're very compressed, sometimes like ridiculously compressed. So as a weird example of how powerful their jaws are, it's pretty rare in lizards to specialize in eating mollusks, but there are at least like one group of worm lizards or one species we know of that is specialized in eating and crunching through mollusks. So the word, this is fun. There's a word for animals that eat or specialize on eating hard-shelled prey. Have you ever heard this? It's called durophagus.
Durophagus.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah, it makes it, I don't know what the root is, but it sounds like it's like durable.
Yeah.
Eat durable things.
Sure.
So the fact that there is a worm lizard that eats snails is pretty amazing when you consider like the different evolutionary pressures going on with this animal, right? So burrowing favors really small compressed heads, but small compressed heads limit what you can feed on, or normally would limit what you can feed on. And yet this African one, this one is called Troganophis wigmani, and it's like one of the few ones that pops up over and over again in papers because it is fairly well studied. I have a picture of him.
He looks more like a sandbower or something. Like,
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting though, even on this one, which has a more pointy head. The last ones we looked at were very rounded on the ends. This one has a pointed end, but it's pointed on both ends, so it still mimics its own tail. Which is kind of cool. This African worm lizard was seen to be selecting for snails during foraging. Like it would ignore isopods and stuff and preferentially go after snails. And so the scientists observing it were like, analyzing its fecal content, and they were like, oh, like a quarter of all the food in here is just snails. That's interesting. And there are, generally speaking, like 2 options for snail eaters, right? You could either be crunching through them to get to the snails, or you could be slurping them out of their shells, basically.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, either one could be the case for these worm lizards. They never actually observed one crunching through the shells in the field before they did the study. But they had seen them using their little wormy heads to like get at the juicy snail meat through the shell opening.
Okay.
So they were like, what's going on here? But then when they analyzed the fecal content, they were finding crushed up shells in the fecal matter. So they were like, there's something here worth investigating. Let's investigate it. So they decided to test this animal's jaw strength, which brings us to this like sort of burrow crush dilemma faced by this animal. So generally speaking, in like super broad scientific terms, bite force is dependent on head size. So bigger your head, bigger you can crush. In these guys, they found that the wider the head was, the more it could crush. But again, if you're burrowing, a narrower head is selected for. And so here's what the researchers said, quote, on the basis of our interspecific analyses, lizards with heads the size of this animal, T. wigmani, should bite merely 1.41 newtons. In reality, an average T. wigmani bites 3.7 times as hard.
Wow.
Huh.
They go on to say, quote, yes, it is unclear how T. wigmani succeeds in combining a small head with a relative high bite force. So other lizards that have that same head size, like not 3.7 newtons, but 3.7 times what other lizards the same head size are able to measure.
Interesting.
And they still don't have an answer for that. Like as a comparison, Sicilians, which are an amphibian that also have those weird like wormy burrowing adaptations, they have this unique dual jaw closing mechanism that allows them to bite hard while also being small and wormy. So like that's an obvious solution. But with these guys, we have no idea. They're like, oh, maybe there's something in the muscles, blah, blah, blah. We have no idea. Sorry, I'm not trying to make them sound sillier, like they don't know what they're talking about. But you know, it's a mystery. So that's pretty cool. So how do they do it? I don't know. Also, how often are they crushing the shells or like entering the shells to pull snails out of them? So they tested this and they found like a wide range of like methods and jaw strength and slurping and all kinds of stuff. So they tested the common snails in the area, and in this spectrum of answers, I'll just give you a couple of examples. The strongest 25% of worm lizard biters could crush all of the Coachella. Look, okay, hang on, let me back up. The strongest 25% of biters could crush all of one type of snail shell, but those good crushers could enter none of these Theba snail shells because they were too wide. Whereas the weakest 25% of biters could only crush 71% of the same snail shell that all of the strong ones could crush, but they could enter 16% of the Theba shells.
Okay.
So anyway, it's like this like crush/burrow head evolution constantly at war even within the own species. There's like a lot of variation on like which shells they can crush, what percentage of shells can they crush, like can they enter them, etc. And the conclusion they came to is that it seems like the composition of snail species around them could play a huge role in the evolution of their head size and their jaw strength. So it's not just burrowing pressures, but snail pressures. And if something happened to these snails while we're bulldozing this critical habitat, you know, this could affect the way that these animals evolve and the way that their jaw structures change. So
That's
anyway.
wild.
That's even within populations of these
The same species. Yes.
You have,
Yeah.
Well, that's evolution in action.
Evolution in action. Pretty
'Cause
crazy.
It never stops.
It
You
never
think it stops.
stops.
It never does. You're evolving. We're all evolving.
We're all
Well, not
evolving.
us, but I mean, at the population level, it's happening right now.
It's true. It's true. Woo.
Yeah.
So anyway, big old strong jaws, big old teeth, and more to learn about that still. good stuff, guys.
was that your conclusion? Yeah. Big old jaws, big old teeth.
Big
Yeah.
old teeth.
I mean, yeah.
yeah.
They did kind of look, the head did kind of, like the skull was a bit xenomorphy, you know?
Yeah.
It has
I
that
was waiting
really
for you to say that
long-
they had pharyngeal gill or
pharyngeal jaws.
yeah, jaws, and they just like reached
Yeah.
out or
Like in the
something.
back of
No,
their
they
throat.
just-
Yeah.
Open like normal jaws. There's nothing unusual about the actual bone structure.
Which is weird because,
Right?
I mean, again, they're burrowing. I mean, I guess their burrow is going to be slightly wider than their head because they're squishing out with their rings and then sliding their body through their skin. But like, but I mean, you'd think it would be like kind of problematic to open your jaws in the confines of a burrow that's only the approximate width of your body.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So
It's like,
what's going on there? Yeah. And maybe a lot of them, that's why they're feeding in other animals' burrows that they're like
makes
stalking
sense.
through.
Yeah.
I don't know. But again, who knows? We only just learned this in like, the last 4 years. So
Interesting.
yeah, to be clear, that wasn't the conclusion of like my episode. I still have one more section.
Oh,
But
I
that
thought
was
I thought that was the conclusion of your episode.
No, sorry, just the conclusion of the jaws and the biting and the eating things.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
All right. Big teeth, big jaws,
Yeah.
long skull.
Yes. It's common in, just as a side note, in the stomach analyses that I was reading through, for them to just have like an uncategorized number of like random arthropod bits because, they would just like crunch through them and tear pieces off of them and they couldn't,
Sure.
identify the species, obviously. So
Yeah, totally. Okay.
victims, yeah.
Yeah.
Victims.
Good little dudes. Yeah. Okay. So the last little section here that I have for you guys has to do with one of the only other senses that I could really find good information about, which was their ability to do chemical sensing and their chemoreceptors. So their chemical sensing capabilities, as far as we can tell so far, are not all that different from other lizards in the sense that, if you picture a lizard, you picture them like tongue flicking and like tasting the ground and stuff. And that's how they're sensing chemicals. That's what these guys do too. They'll pull their little tongues out and taste things around them. It might be that they have more developed glands for this compared to other lizards. I did not find any data talking about this. Honestly, most of the studies, sometimes when you read papers, you're just like, all right, skip through all this. Like, I just want to see the discussion and like, I don't need to know exactly how many test tubes you had or whatever. But occasionally I'll get to the conclusion. I'm like, how did you know that they were interested? Like,
Right.
So in this, there were 2 studies that I found published by the same researcher. Actually, I wrote his name down. Let me find it. I like shouting out researchers who are just like super into this stuff. It's like, man, this one guy is doing so much work for me. Thank you so much. What was his name? Ernesto Garcia. So shout out to Ernesto Garcia. Thank you
Nice.
for doing studies on these animals. Yeah. So they were trying to basically figure out how they could distinguish smells. And they'd be like, oh yeah, like these guys could differentiate between familiar animals or like female animals based on just smell alone. And I'm like, well, how do you know? Like if you're holding up a Q-tip of like a lady lizard cloaca juice up to like, how do you know that he can tell that's a lady? Like what's the Okay, so here's how they know. I went back. I was like, I gotta read the whole methods part. They just measure how many times they flick their tongue.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Okay.
So I guess it's really well known that the number of tongue flicks corresponds to the level of interest they have in the smell and therefore corresponds to, I guess, whether it's familiar to them or not, or whether they care.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this like brings up, I just finished reading An Immense World by Ed Yong. So I'm like fully in this like conspiracy theory, like message board thing of like, well, how do we know that's what they're experiencing? Like, how do we know they're interested? Like, what if they're just like taking extra tastes because they're like, ooh, I like that juice. You know, like what we don't actually know what the experience of these animals is. Like all we know is like that they're flicking their tongues out more.
Right.
So I know there's other studies that kind of back this up, and there's a reason why we built this conjecture, but it does bring up a lot of questions for me. Anyway, let me back up. Chemical sensing is obviously very important to a semi-blind lizard, and it turns out that these guys have both cloacal secretions and pre-cloacal secretions. There's some sort of gland in front of the cloaca that secretes scents, and this is what we've studied. There may be other chemical sensing or other like familiarity building things going on in this creature, but this is the thing that has been studied. So in one species, again, the same species, that little like weird guy. Sorry, they're all weird.
They're all little
I
weird
know.
guys.
The T. wigmani.
Okay.
In a study on this little guy, they determined that the species can discriminate between a familiar partner and an unfamiliar individual of the same sex as the partner. So talking if it's like a male-female pair that has like a pair bond established, which by the way, that's a thing that happens. So in a opposite sex pairing, the male would be able to distinguish his partner from an unfamiliar female. And the females could do the same thing for their male partner. Like they're able to discriminate their individual partner.
Sure.
And actually, I think that this research predated us having any knowledge about the interspecies relationships or any kind of family unit relationships. So I think a lot of what we know about how they might interact with their own members of their own species comes from this. Like it stands to reason if they can distinguish between a partnered female and a non-partnered female, and they're more interested in their own partner, then there's definitely some sort of pair bonding going on with this species.
Sure.
Otherwise, why would they care?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also true that for males specifically, they can definitely discriminate sex, or again, at the very least, they care about a distinction between sex. Females didn't appear to discriminate between sex. And again, this is where I'm like putting myself in the brains of the creature, where I'm like, well, does the female, can she not discriminate, or does she not care?
Yeah.
Is it like, it doesn't matter to her, you know? So like, who cares? Equal amount of tongue flicks, it doesn't matter to me. Whereas the males might be experiencing some aggression toward males of the same species. And so for them, it definitely matters. Regardless, they're very interested. They can tell if the sex of their own species from scent alone. And it looks like males recognize, or again, at the very least, care about their own scent, whereas females really don't care at all. If you can share her own scent with her and some other scent with her, and she won't care. The males really, really care about their own scent. So they probably have some sort of like scent marking territorial stuff going on that's communicating with other males in a territorial way. And that maybe also means why they would care about other males and being able to distinguish sex in that way.
Right.
So there's obviously a lot of information that they're communicating through their scents and their scent glands. And so it does seem like this T. wigmani is able to form stable long-term pairs. I think this is something that's been observed in labs, and this is really good evidence for that. And that's pretty uncommon in reptiles, but slightly more common in lizards. So that's pretty cool. And it looks like this familiar chemosensory recognition must be important for maintaining the pair bond between them, and recognizing new individuals, and maybe even mate guarding is some of the things we've hypothesized about these creatures. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Is chemical signaling common in reptiles? I mean, you hear it all the time in like mammals, like spraying things or hyena butter and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah. I guess I never really thought about it in reptiles.
Yeah, and I honestly couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I know that these papers I was reading would reference other lizards as a comparison, especially skinks, which maybe have some at least behavioral similarities to these animals. But yeah, I'm not sure. Like, obviously snakes have a lot of musk. Whether they use that just for defense or are using it to communicate with each other, I couldn't tell you. But they are so good at chemoreception that it seems like they would be able to. Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that was the first study that Ernesto Garcia published on chemoreception in these guys. The second study he published in 2021 had more to do with big family groups. And this is a viviparous species. So there's both egg-laying species and quote-unquote live birth species in worm lizards. This one just pops out fully formed babies. Basically, for listeners at home, if you're not familiar with viviparous species, they technically have eggs. There's nothing super unique about their reproduction except that they don't put the shell on the egg and they retain the eggs inside their body. So by the time the eggs develop and hatch, they're just still inside the female and they just slither out of her in a normal birth way, not like a horror movie way. Cool. So basically, the female pops out a litter of babies. They all are living in the same burrow. Well, actually, we don't know for sure because this hasn't been super well observed, except in captivity. So apparently, females, but not males, can distinguish familiar versus unfamiliar juveniles. So the females are very in tune with their own offspring and their scent and will discriminate between their own offspring. And again, this leads to some interesting
implications.
Yeah, you can extrapolate from that some interesting implications about what their family units might be like. And again, reptiles don't often, it's pretty uncommon actually to have a high level of parental care. It's more common in certain groups, like obviously crocodilians and skinks are pretty well known for having parental care. So it's not that far-fetched to think that there would be some sort of parental care going on, whether it's, and even protection with offspring too. So they also studied the youngsters and the males, and the males don't seem to care whether it's their own offspring, which makes sense because why would they know that it's their own offspring?
Sure,
The female birthed them and they're in the same little tunnel system together. So that makes sense. The males, even if they're, hanging out in the same tunnel system with their female, don't have any guarantee that they're their offspring. Juveniles, on the other hand, do not seem to recognize adult females. So they don't really seem to care whether it's their mom, but they'll be like, oh, there's a female skink. Okay, cool. And on the opposite side of things, they can recognize familiar males. So baby worm lizards can be like, oh, that's a male I recognize versus oh, that's not a male I recognize. Yeah. And we don't know why that would be the case.
Are they killing their children,
right?
And they'll just beg from any female. They're like, hey.
Or are males they recognize, they're like, oh, that guy's cool, he hasn't eaten me yet, so I'll be fine. But if it's an unfamiliar male, they'll be like, run. I don't know. And it's weird that they wouldn't distinguish their own mom when their own mom does distinguish them.
Yeah.
Well, the male doesn't distinguish the young either.
Yeah. He doesn't care. But they're like, oh, I don't know you, stranger.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What is going on there?
Right? Weird. And what's also interesting is that it's obvious that, for the animals that are picking up on signals, those signals are there to be picked up. So again, it's are they sensing it, but they just don't care? Are they does their way that they sense things change over time? Why is it that juveniles, no matter the sex, are able to distinguish these things, but then when they grow up, suddenly what they care about completely changes? I mean, I guess it makes sense, but we just know so little about the way these animals behave in the wild that it's, a lot of conjecture.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
I mean, what options do you really have for wild observation?
Yeah.
Probe cameras.
Right. Yeah. I mean, basically.
Yeah.
it's just so hard to study animal, and when they're sometimes small or difficult to locate. And again, with this group in general, because some of them are obviously more well studied than others, and others are just like being bulldozed up and we don't even know what soil it came out of, or yeah, it's hard to gather information.
Interesting. Yeah.
Untapped field, which I'm sure will expand upon the more we destroy the habitat and find more of them.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
We just need robot worm lizards
With cameras in their mouths.
Yep.
And fake cloacal secretions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's easy to figure. Yeah,
that's easy.
Yeah, we can make that happen.
So to sum up this like little section here, the researcher Garcia, he hypothesized that for some of the ways that they're behaving with each other, there might be other scents or other senses besides cloacal secretions that are involved. There could be some sort of parental care or protection happening that would cause them to behave this way, and we need to learn more.
Like these are very essential things about their nature. Like these are massive behavioral questions that are just totally unknown. Yeah, it's
pretty exciting.
It is exciting. I mean, to have not only just like but like a entire taxa of animals that aren't really this well understood.
Yeah,
wild.
Just down there undulating in tunnels, hunting in the darkness.
Undulating.
Is your fear of worms why you hated the Australian giant worm so much?
Probably.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a natural,
It's big.
Things shouldn't be bigger than they should be. You know what I mean? Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to hear a worm moving underground.
Yeah.
No.
I guess that's like a concluding note. Obviously, I've said everything there can be said, at least that I can say about worm lizards for now. Things that I thought were interesting, at least. And just as a side note, since so many of these guys live in South America and a lot of that habitat is in danger more so than some of the other species, I'll just end with a little note that a lot of the development is pretty detrimental to fossorial creatures, the type of development that's happening. When you think about like rototilling soil and then animals that are trying to burrow in the soil, like not only is this really detrimental to like the lizards and snakes that live in burrows and cavities and termite mounds, but it's also super detrimental to the creatures that are creating a lot of those nests and underground burrows that are, it's like a whole underground system, which is again so common in grasslands. And this also makes it really difficult to escape fires, which is again, like most grasslands, a healthy part of the ecosystem. And as human development changes, the fire regimes are changing, and that's definitely causing some harm to them too. So, hopefully, as it sucks that a lot of development's happening, but maybe there will be some silver linings in that. The more of this evidence we can have to show, like, hey, like we've known for a while the Cerrado and these other grasslands are not barren wastelands, but here's even more evidence, if you needed it, of why we should care about them. Because even though these little worm creatures are super creepy and worms are objectively scary and they have really big teeth and they can crush through shells and they're super weird, they're pretty cute and they love their babies and they're just down there trying not to drown.
Yeah. Have you done the math on how big a worm lizard would need to be before it could like bite through a human femur?
No, I should have done that. You're right. That's my
important math.
Yeah. Let me just do some calculations, and when we're editing the podcast, I'll record a little like, "Hey, Rachel from the future here."
Okay.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Well, you really like Dune, though.
Dune is a fun series. It's not because of the worms.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying, it's still very worm-centric fiction.
Oh, yeah. Very worm-centric fiction.
Yeah.
I do enjoy worm-related media, possibly because I find them scary.
Yeah.
That's good. That's valid. Yeah. Very nice.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying stuff.
Yeah. Well, do you guys remember the scene in Tremors where it eats the station wagon and like the guys in the car and like you see this, it just like sinks. You see the headlights go into the dirt. Oh, love it. Anyway,
Man, did I watch it as an adult with you guys?
We watched it at some point, I think. I don't really remember.
All I know is that when I was a child, I watched it. I did not touch that piece of media again the rest of my life because I was so scared of it. And then I watched it as an adult, probably with you guys, and I was shocked that it was funny.
yeah,
Just
it's
fully shocked.
It's real goofy. There's like, first of all, they've made like 10 of those movies.
Oh, yeah.
There's one that's like in the Wild West. It's great stuff. Anyway.
Wild.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for sharing your wormy fears and wormy fascinations with us.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah, it was very good. And thank you, Ernesto Garcia, for studying this so intensely. Perhaps
bro.
leaving us with more questions than answers, but that's part of the scientific process.
I'm just trusting him to be working on it,
Yeah.
Why would he give up at this point?
Why?
He's 2 papers in,
Yeah.
at least.
Keep going, Ernesto. All right. Thank you for listening. The Best Biome is produced through our nonprofit Grassland Groupies, dedicated to inspiring the conservation of grasslands. In the show notes, you can find our website, phone number, social media, text, call. We're still saying tweet, text, call, or tweet your suggestions.
What else could you
Fan
say?
mail. What
X?
did they say?
X your
Xing?
suggestion.
I have
Xing
no
your
idea.
suggestion?
That-
I will
you can't
never
say
do
that.
I will never
Nor should you.
do that. Okay, text, call, or tweet your suggestions, fan mail, or hate mail. If you enjoyed the show and you want to support us, tell your friends about it and leave a review. We could not do this without your support. We'll see you again in a month. I think in Trimmers 2, it was all about oil drilling. So, I don't know. I wouldn't have Kevin Bacon, though. All right.
Oh, what's the point?
Bye.
Bye.